Welcome to Navigating Receiverships, a podcast from the Commercial Receivers Association, focused on building a better understanding of what brings companies into receivership, what happens in receivership, what makes them unique, some alternatives to receiverships, and ultimately, what happens to the business as the receivership is closed out. I'm one of your hosts, Eric Morcheski, CRE board member and CEO of Nimble Strategies. Welcome to Navigating Receiverships. I'm here today with Marc Fischer, President and CEO of InspiRE CRE. Marc, thank you so much for joining us today. Can you tell us a little bit about your background and your company?
Sure. And thanks for the opportunity, Eric. It's great to be with you on your podcast. So I've spent about 32 years in commercial real estate, mostly in the Mid-Atlantic, Maryland, DC, Virginia region. And during that time, I've had the opportunity to serve as a receiver and court-appointed receiver and in various roles for distressed assets over the course of the last maybe 4 real estate cycles. So it's been kind of a labor of love to do that. In addition to the receivership work that I do, I'm a commercial real estate consultant, and I focus on helping companies be better at commercial real estate, property management, asset management, and operations. And part of that includes expert witness services. Part of that includes helping companies write SOPs and standard practices. And part of it even includes helping companies build out learning materials and courses and educational content. Everything that I do here and everything that our team does here is all based on the concept of real estate operations and how do we help companies use their real estate more effectively and improve their operations.
Yeah, obviously a challenging time in commercial real estate right now. So I think it's apt to have this discussion and share your experience and your interests with everyone that's listening into this. I know the DC market that you're in is obviously a little bit unique compared to most of the rest of the country because it is a little more protected by government, although maybe that's changing just based on our wild last few weeks we've had. But can you tell us a little bit? I know we're here to kind of talk about a specific receivership, but can you tell us a little bit about what you've seen kind of locally for yourself and for what's going on in that DMV region?
Sure. I think the first thing to keep in mind is, having spent my entire career primarily based in this region and working nationally and internationally, but primarily being based in this region, we've always had this mantra that, the federal government is a stabilizing force. And between the federal government direct leasing and the government contractor leasing, there is a built-in safety net in Maryland, DC, Virginia, especially in the areas that are closest to the DC. And the idea has always been that the ups and downs are less pronounced here in Mid-Atlantic. And we don't really see the same level of recessionary forces on real estate here like you might in other parts of the country because of that stabilizing factor. And I think, one of the main challenges here is that may not be the case anymore. And I think one of the pieces that we've talked about a lot over the last couple of years has been that this is really a unique situation. It's unprecedented. And I'm meaning that word specifically and not using it euphemistically. It is unprecedented that we have this change in interest rates. At the same time, we have a work from home environment where people are working from home or working remotely or working in a hybrid work environment post-COVID. I think companies are reevaluating their real estate needs and are downsizing quite a bit. There's a lot going on that we have never seen. And I think the major question for a lot of this is, in previous recessions, you just say, I'm going to hold on until things get better because ultimately things would improve and get back to where they were before. The real unknown that, I think if you've got a prognosticator who says they know what the future is going to look like, I wouldn't believe them. I think the real unknown is what does normal look like? And when the interest rates go back down and, how long is it going to be if they're ever going to go down to where they were, the 3% range a couple of years ago. But when the interest rates go back down, what happens to the user experience? Are we still going to have a hybrid work environment? We've been based on this idea that employment has been really strong. Unemployment's been very low. So the employees have been in the driver's seat and employees have been able to push back somewhat successfully to say, I'm not willing to come back to work 5 days a week. The challenge here, I think, is that we don't know what that looks like. We don't know if everybody's coming back to work. We don't know if companies are going to use space the same way. We don't know what the future looks like. And it's fair to say that there is an argument that it's not going to look like it did 2 years ago, 3 years ago, 5 years ago. So I think this cycle's a little bit different because it's not business as usual. It is a fundamental change in the way we're using office space in particular. And so when we look at the DC market, again, we've always said that government stabilizes. Well, you know, what's going to happen with the government programs? How many employees are going to be here? There's news about GSA canceling leases very suddenly, very quickly. GSA has been typically very methodical, very thoughtful in how they do things. And it does take a longer process, but they've been really thoughtful. In this case, there's just been news of, I think it was 11 or 12 significant leases that were terminated very quickly just within the last couple of weeks. That's a major issue. There's a lot of concern that if the push from the administration to bring everybody back to work occurs, there's not enough seats for everybody. So there's a lot of issues in the DC market that are unknown, and this is really the first time that we're dealing with it. I think we are also seeing a flight to quality, and companies are able to step up and take a higher quality trophy building instead of a Class A building maybe, or Bs go to As. And I think right now there certainly are some changes underway that we're still kind of figuring out what it's going to look like.
And I think that last point you touched on is a little bit more of a universal truth right now across the country is that people are that Class A buildings, the trophy buildings are still in demand. It's when you get to Class C, especially, you're starting to see a lot of uncertainty and lack of lease ups going on across the country, at least in the people that I've talked to. I'm sure you talk to a lot more real estate agents, commercial real estate agents across the country than I do. I'm assuming you're kind of hearing the same thing.
Yeah, I kind of think of it as a tale of two cities. I think those small Class C buildings are always going to attract 1,000, 1,500 square foot, 2,000 square foot local tenants. And they're looking for economical space, maybe. And I
Mhm.
think those users they're around, they're available. The tough part for those is that at Class C rents, with the operating expenses rising, it's
Mhm.
really hard to make the numbers work. But there is a demand for Class C space. So I think that's a little different. If you've got a 50 or 100,000 square foot suburban office building,
Mhm.
they're not going to go chasing the 2,000 square foot tenant because it doesn't make sense. And
Yeah.
so, the tale of two cities is that in some cases, it's the Class C buildings are actually doing relatively well because of the kind of client they're trying to attract. And the
Okay.
A and trophy buildings are doing well because there's a flight to quality. I think the piece that's going to get squeezed are the Bs.
Hmm. That's an interesting perspective to it all. So, kind of pivoting then now to your receivership work and what you're doing. You mentioned you've gone through 4 cycles with ups and downs in the markets and everything in your career. You've gotten to work some really fascinating receivership cases on the commercial real estate side. I know we're going to talk about one here today. Can you kind of give us some background of the receivership we're here to discuss?
Sure. I mean, I think we'll try to weave in a variety of different receivership assignments because I think as we talk about different questions, there are certain receiverships that lend themselves towards maybe certain discussions because each one's different. And that's one of the things I find not only challenging but also exciting about receivership work is every single receivership is different. And every project that you go into, you really have to use all of your knowledge and experience to figure out what the best strategy is for that assignment. Ultimately, everyone's different. And so the one I want to focus on today is a portfolio receivership based in the suburbs of Washington, D.C. and Maryland. And this was a receivership that was CMBS, came back to a special servicer, but it was a portfolio of about 10 Class B suburban office buildings and industrial buildings, all in the same business park. So you had some single story office, single story flex space, some single story industrial space, and then some low rise 2, 3, 4 story office space as part of the portfolio. And what made it challenging is that it took a while for the receivership to get approved. And in that time, the landlord, the owner, the borrower, was trying to stabilize the asset by doing lease deals. But one of the complexities is they didn't have the capital to actually go forward with the tenant improvement, pay the leasing commissions, and move forward. So not only did we walk into a situation where we had the typical receivership challenges, but in this case, we had a couple of deals that had been done that were stuck in limbo and they couldn't go forward because the owner didn't have the capital to do it. And it really created a mess. In one case, one of the buildings was sold. The building was fully leased to a mega church. And part of the agreement was the mega church had to move by the end of November. And when we got the receivership the week after Christmas, that mega church was still in the premises. So they had still been in the premises 30 days past their point at which they were obligated under the sale contract to get out. That really created an issue because there was no permit pulled for the space they were moving to. They were moving them within the portfolio to another building. There was no permit pulled. There was no bidding done for construction. And at the end, it turned out that they really hadn't even focused on what the costs were to move that church. Because it's a mega church, because it's an assembly project, that changed the fire code, it changed the sprinkler code, it changed egress, it changed all of the aspects of the construction. And when they ultimately had budgeted about $600,000 to do the TI, it turned into about a $2.4 million TI by the time we had to go through the code process and the process of getting approvals. That was a nightmare. They did a lease with a GSA tenant to take a full building, so a significant lease. And the lease was signed, and GSA had been begging them to begin the work, and GSA had begun the process of taking the assignment back and unwinding the lease deal. And it was really our receivership team got involved, attorneys got involved, and we worked with GSA to reignite that deal and get things put back on target so that we could deliver that space. And we ultimately were successful with that. So that was a giant load. And then the last big one was they had a full floor tenant user at one of the mid-rise buildings that, again, the tenant had signed the lease. They had a construction agreement with a contractor, but they couldn't start work because they didn't have enough money to pay the contractor. And we walked in the week of Christmas and ended up having to start construction within a few days on a significant TI project. And complicating that situation, there was a significant HVAC pipe in the ceiling on the top floor of the building that was leaking. And it was a condenser water pipe going to and from the cooling towers, and it was leaking significantly. And we ended up having to, in addition to this construction project, we had to figure out what are we going to do? How are we going to replace this or work around this HVAC problem at the same time that we're doing construction in that space, and do it in a way that we cannot impede the construction because we got a due date to move the tenant in. So it was probably the most challenging from the standpoint of, on the first day we walked in the door, we were months behind on 3 significant improvement projects that required an incredible amount of work to make it happen. Not all projects are that complicated, but that one was particularly complicated by the fact that we were behind the gun right at the gate starting out.
So, with there not being the funds in place to move those tenant improvement pieces forward, what did you do as the receiver? How did you get the funds in place to pay a contractor to get that work moving or move those tenant improvements forward? Because obviously the lender that was in as part of this was kind of tapped out, or the developer that was in owning these buildings was tapped out. Where did you find the funds to get those TI tenant improvement pieces done?
Well, I think if we look at the church, first of all, that was an obligation at that point. So there was no issue. We were obligated to make that happen. The other two were leases that were signed before we got there. And in all 3 of those cases, we were able to work with a special servicer to show the value creation that they would generate for the asset value. And look, you're either going to sell the buildings the way they are right now, or we could put these deals together. This is what the impact would be to asset value, and here's the investment it takes to get there. The special servicer saw the potential and agreed that, hey, that's a good return on our investment. It makes sense to put more money into these assets to do those things because we're going to get it back on the sale.
Yeah, and I think that was a smart move, obviously, as you saw the ability to educate and through that education, you were able to define a better outcome. And real quick, I know you touched on this really early on. You mentioned that this was a CMBS loan. Can you explain to our listeners, what might make that even a little bit more of a interesting scenario for a receivership?
Yeah, if you go back to the beginning of my career, when I started doing receiverships early on, it was a traditional lender. It was typically a traditional bank. And so the bank had the assets on their books and the bank was the lender. And it was really simple to talk to the bank, and the bank made decisions based on what's in the bank's best interest. And once we started moving over to commercial mortgage-backed securities, things changed quite a bit. And basically, in many large loans today are CMBS, commercial mortgage-backed securities, where essentially the mortgages are packaged into a bundle and they're sold on the market so that ultimately companies buy shares in these big portfolios of mortgages. So we've gone from having to go to one single group, the lender being a bank, have a conversation with a banker about what makes the most sense, to now we work with special servicers who are charged with managing this and servicing a loan when it's in distress. But the challenge is we don't have one person to go to. There's not one lender. There's lots and lots of owners that are involved. The good news is that at the receivership level, once we start working with the special servicer, we don't have to deal with that aspect of it. We're really working with the special servicer to act in an asset manager capacity to help them understand, here are the four choices we have here. We recommend this choice and here's why. And how would you like to proceed?
I think that that's great just for people to understand. And I mean, obviously, from the borrower standpoint, when it used to be working with a bank directly for that loan, you had a relationship that you could build from and perhaps persuade them to give you an extension to increase your loan amounts that you might need, but it's a lot harder to do with a special servicer that you have no relationship with from a borrower standpoint. And my assumption is that also kind of plays through with the receivership as well.
It does, yeah. And to the point we made earlier too, I mean, sometimes we do take an asset and we make the argument that it makes good sense, and here's the financial reasons to invest money into this asset because we're going to get a return.
Mhm.
But we've also done a ton of receiverships where we've said, sell this baby. There's no way you're going to put paint on this pig and make anything out of it. This is going to be a dog, and it makes no sense to put money into it. Sell it at auction, sell it at a fire sale, get rid of this because it's not going to get any better,
Mhm.
and kind of everything in between. So sometimes you have the option of adding asset value through strategic asset management processes. Sometimes there's nothing you're going to do to change the situation, and you just get rid of that building as fast as you can. So it's really, I think it's a combination of having a really good receivership attorney
Mhm.
and having a commercial real estate expert on the team. Whether that attorney serves as the receiver and the asset management function is done by a real estate expert, or whether the real estate person is a receiver and you hire the receivership attorney to represent in court. Either way, I think it is best when we have a good partnership between an attorney and a commercial real estate expert.
Yeah, I think the right team is always critical, no matter the receivership. So you make a really strong point there. Jumping back into this receivership that we're discussing, so you've come in, you've persuaded the lender to invest further so that you can finish out the tenant improvement projects and get those three groups satisfied and moved in. What did you have to do kind of next through the receivership to actually eventually close it out?
Well, I think the goal was to improve leasing, not just the lease deals that were done, but also we wanted to maximize and optimize leasing. And we felt like we treated the assets as what we would call a value add opportunity. Value add meaning that we can invest capital and increase the appreciation of the asset or increase asset value to the point where it makes sense to sell it at the end at an increased value. So that the idea of looking at it as value add means that we're going to put resources into the asset so that we get more value when we sell it. That means that the buyer is going to be a buyer that's going to want to buy a relatively stable asset. On the other hand, there's sometimes that we don't want to necessarily invest that capital, and you can allow the buyer to be the person who's going to add value to it. So the question really is, in all of these cases, is who's going to really get to add the value? Is it going to be the receivership process and the REO process after the receivership is over? Is that going to be where we add value and we sell a stabilized building to the marketplace? Or do we sell an unstable building and let the other person be the value add? In this case, there was a compelling argument for us to stabilize the assets. And we were able also to evaluate the buildings, do a really good capital dive and understand what the capital needs are, what building systems are in what condition, what needs to be replaced. We had a couple of roofs that were significantly damaged and needed to be replaced. We had some HVAC equipment that was end of useful life that was falling apart that needed to get replaced. So we were able to put a capital project list together, and we showed the compelling reasons to do that. And you're either going to do that or you're going to kick the can down the road and you're going to get retraded when you sell the building. So it makes sense to do it now and stabilize things. And we redoubled the leasing efforts, put some incentives into encouraging brokers to bring groups to the table. We were really aggressive in the leases we did. We were able to deliver on construction projects very quickly and move tenants in very quickly. And ultimately, within about 18 months, the buildings were stabilized enough that we sold them in two parcels. We sold the industrials off to an industrial lender or an industrial investor, and we sold the office product off to the county government. And the county bought them with the intent that they were going to, over time, convert them into county government buildings. And what they loved about it is there was some immediate vacancy that they could move into, but they didn't have enough need for all of the space in the beginning. So they loved the idea that they were going to be able to take over more space in the buildings as tenants' leases expired. Surprisingly enough, it worked out to be an advantage to us that we had some lease rollover over the next 5 years because the government entity was able to move into the building in increments.
Yeah. So it sounds like you had a nice, successful exit out of the receivership. Were there any lessons learned from your own perspective as you went through all of this?
I think the lesson learned was at that time, we had done maybe 3 other receiverships with that special servicer, and we were working with the same asset manager for that special servicer. And one of the challenges here is that the big special servicing companies, and there's half a dozen significant ones around the country, they have lots and lots of asset managers. They have really big teams. They're big groups. Sometimes you can have the same group as your special servicer, but you can have different asset managers. One really big benefit here is that we had worked with that asset manager for quite a while. We had developed a level of trust, and we were able to really sit down and say, look, we've analyzed this building top to bottom. Here are our recommendations. Here's why we think this is going to work. Here's what the impact is on asset value. And we had an asset manager who had significant commercial real estate experience who got it and was able to go, yep, I understand that completely. I think that's a good plan. So I love the fact that that special servicer had hired specifically asset managers with 20 years of asset management experience to work on their special servicing practice so that they could really help get these buildings out of special servicing and back out into the marketplace. So the lesson learned was it really does make sense to have a relationship. And sometimes it's very hard to do that because it's not like you've got that local lender that you're talking to. The other thing was, think creatively. And we really had to think creatively about how are we going to turn these things around? What can we do? And I'll say it differently. What can we do to get this GSA lease back in line again? And we were told from the very beginning that the contracting officer had said, I've been here 20 years. There has never been a case where we started to unwind a deal like this and the company was able to come back in and get the deal put back together again. And we were able to do that. And that's a monumental difference. It's really also building a good team. We had a good team of leasing agents who knew that market and submarket very well. We had a group of sales agents who knew the market really well. We had really good connections with the county government and were able to present this to them for a lot of different reasons. Had really good construction management, so we worked very closely with construction management. And the lesson learned is it's a team effort, and it really does involve everybody and all the resources of your company coming together to be successful. And quite honestly, I just love that aspect of it. I think that's the the most fun of this is that you get to take a building that has lots and lots of challenges and then figure out what to do to solve those problems in a unique way that makes financial and operational sense to do it.
Yeah, I think you touched on a piece right there towards the end, but that answers a lot of my next question, which is, what should others take away from this? And building that right team, obviously, is something you've touched on several times throughout this. And I think it's team doesn't necessarily mean only InspiRE CRE. It means your attorney, obviously. It might mean, in some cases, you might be supporting a receiver who engages InspiRE to handle the real estate portion of this. But, are there any other kind of key takeaways that you see that people should really hear from a story like this?
Yeah, and one of the things to keep in mind too, Eric, is when we talk about a team, during the receivership, the receiver is going to work with special services to identify those team members. So they're going to hire a property management company and a leasing team and a investment sales team and construction management, and the receiver's in a spot to kind of put the team together. And what's really interesting about it is that you get to assemble the dream team. You can take the best of all worlds. You could say that, hey, the best property manager for this property is this company. The best leasing team might be that company or might be somebody else. The best investment sales team, hey, we know we're going to sell this to the local government, so we want to hire this team because they've got that expertise. And what's really neat about it is you get to be strategic in how you put the team together. And then another aspect of this too is we think about the receivership as 3 to 6 months. It's usually relatively short. It is an opportunity to stabilize the asset and get it to the point where it winds through the court and we exchange the title back into the special servicer or the lender's name. As you think about that process, one of the key pieces to think about is that there's still another aspect of that, and that is what happens after the receivership. And so another aspect of what we offer is what we would call REO, real estate owned services, where sometimes the company doesn't have an asset management function, and we can step in and serve as a consulting role even after the receivership is over to help the special servicer or help the lender make good decisions about the assignment. Sometimes that's not going to necessarily be something that we do with a big special servicer because they've got an asset management function. But where it really helps is for that local lender that maybe doesn't have an asset management function. They don't have a department. They don't really want to take real estate back and have it back in their name. And so we provide an additional services after the receivership, continuing to be involved as that asset manager on a fractional basis to help them make the best decisions. So to us, we look at it as full service. We help in the beginning, before the building goes bad. What can we do with that borrower to help them not get in a receivership situation? What can we do to help them stabilize the asset? Can we come up with creative ideas? And then the next step would be during the receivership, we provide support. And then we can also provide support after the receivership's over. And the idea of bringing in a professional real estate expert is that hopefully we can help the borrower not have to get into trouble in the first place or help them get out of trouble in the first place. Hopefully we can help them renegotiate the lease, the mortgage terms, the deal terms. Hopefully we can do a lot of things beforehand. If we get to the receivership, we can deal with the building in that phase to protect the asset. And then the third aspect would be after it's all over, we can help to navigate that until the building's sold down the road. So it's kind of cradle to grave, if you want to look at it that way.
Yeah, I think that's a really helpful aspect of what you offer. So as we wrap up here, is there any parting thoughts you want to leave people with?
What is fascinating me too over the years has been the places where you get stuck to do something that doesn't make financial sense, but it has to get done to stabilize the asset. And one example in particular was a building in the same county that we took back as a receivership. The lender was a big institutional investor, so we were able to work directly with that investor. And it was just fascinating because they had a single story parking deck that had deteriorated to the point where it was dangerous to even drive on it. And it was less expensive to replace the deck than it was to try to do repairs on it. And it was about $1.5 million cost to do the replacement. And if you look at that in terms of if I were an investor buying the building, I never would invest $1.5 million in the asset because the building wasn't worth 5 million to start off with.
Mhm.
And if that was one though where we knew we couldn't do anything with it if we didn't do the replacement. And so sometimes you're able to step in and you're able to be the voice of reason and you can make good asset management decisions. And some of these assignments, in order to stabilize it so you can get it out of the books, you've got to make decisions that would otherwise be things you wouldn't do. And it's also, I think the other aspect that is a learning experience is that sometimes you get complete and total professionalism from the company that is losing the assignment, losing the building. Sometimes they are willing to meet you on site. They go through the files, they go through the vendors. They spend a lot of time with you making sure there's a smooth transition. And then sometimes the parties will do everything possible to make the transition as unsmooth as possible. I've had buildings we've taken over where they took all of the keys out of the key box, took the markers off of them, threw them in a big box. And so you had a couple hundred keys and you had no idea what they went to. We've had folks who've taken all of the files out of the file folders and stacked them in a giant pile of messed up, mixed up folders and files in the center of the conference room. Just a lot of really petty stuff. They will sometimes maybe not give you the passwords for the energy management system or for the access control system. And from a human nature standpoint, I've always been the believer of the karma that I'm going to give good karma out into the universe. It's going to pay me back. And I'm still blown away by how people get really petty towards that receivership. And sometimes they take it really personally and act out in ways that are surprising.
Yeah, I've had the key one happen before, and my simplest solution to that is that's what interns are for.
Or, or quite frankly, from a safety standpoint, we rekey the building
Yeah,
because we don't know who has keys
yeah,
and who has a master. So they thought it was going to be a big deal, but the reality is we were going to rekey anyway. And
yeah,
that's kind of part of the standard operating procedure coming in is make sure you have good control. But yeah, I mean, it's an interesting thing. And I love the fact that everyone's different. I love the fact that when you think you've seen it all, something else comes out. And it's a lot of fun to be able to help in that situation to turn things around.
yeah. Well, I think that's a really good thought, and it's one of the aspects that I really enjoy of receivership work as well. Is no 2 days are ever the same, and no two receiverships are ever the same. And yeah, I sat through appeals court yesterday on one of my receiverships, and that was kind of the explanation that had to be given to the appeals court is there's nothing like this. Like we're gonna have to create from scratch here. But with that said, I really appreciate you joining us today, Mark. This was a great conversation, and I have always found everything you've had to share on the commercial real estate side extremely interesting and educational because that's not my background, and there's a lot of great professionals like yourself out there that can really teach those of us that don't do the commercial real estate side. Is frequently a lot of valuable information. So thank you so much for joining us today.
Thanks for the opportunity, Eric. I now can say that I've officially done a podcast.
Yeah, you can check that box.
Thank you. Have a great day.
You too. Thank you for joining Navigating Receiverships, brought to you by the Commercial Receivers Association. Find more information at commercialreceiver.org and catch every Navigating Receiverships podcast by subscribing through your favorite platform today.